As an introduction, I'm Rob Franklin. I'm a senior consultant here at Age Associates, and I'm delighted to say I'm also joined by Megan Welsh, the Sustainability Manager at Higgidy. So just before we get into the detail of the webinar itself today, just a few housekeeping points for the webinar itself. We do ask that all attendees please mute and turn off their camera, and that just facilitates the discussion and sort of removes any background noise in that sense. Today's session is going to last around 45 minutes and will be a kind of a discussion-based webinar regarding Higgidy's journey towards acting on sustainability. And we will have time for a Q&A session towards the end of the webinar as well. The webinar itself will be recorded and alongside the slides of today's session will also be sent round to all attendees after the session has been completed this afternoon. So yeah, the main kind of focus of the webinar this afternoon is to really get into the detail of firstly kind of the support that Age Associates have provided Higgidy as an organisation, but really to also get into the detail of what sustainability journey Higgidy as an organisation has been through, and we're going to kind of talk you through that process from kind of start to where we are now and where the support has gone with Higgidy as well. So I guess if we start kind of at the beginning of that journey, Megan, I think to kind of kick things off, it'd be great to give the audience kind of an insight into, I guess, your role across Higgidy. But also, I guess, the journey sort of ambition that Higgidy are working towards as well.
Yeah, of course. Afternoon, everybody. So as Rob said, my name's Megan. I'm Sustainability Manager at Higgidy. For anyone who doesn't know, Higgidy are a food manufacturer. We're based sort of on the south coast down in Shoreham, and we make a variety of savoury food dishes, pies, quiches, and savoury snacking, things like rolls and slices and mini muffins. And really my role as Sustainability Manager is all about sort of bringing all the stuff that we've already done together and creating a strategy around what Higgidy is going to do for that next stage of our sustainability journey, I suppose. And the creation of my role actually came out of our B Corp accreditation. So we became B Corp accredited last year, which was really exciting. And as part of that journey, that really helped us to kind of hone in and identify some of the areas that we wanted to start focusing on. And environment and carbon was one of those things. So the sustainability manager role is quite heavily focused on what we're doing in that area. So yeah, that's what I'm up to at Higgidy.
Fantastic, thanks, Megan. Yeah, and I think it's going to be really interesting to kind of drill down into the detail of, I guess, specific elements of that journey, which we'll go into a bit more detail on as well. So I guess, again, sort of looking at the start of the journey, what was the initial kind of motivation for Higgidy to become involved and actively progressing your organisation's sort of sustainability ambitions? And I guess what are the specific outcomes of that initial journey on sustainability as well?
So I guess, as I mentioned, part of us becoming B Corp really helped us to identify those areas. And we've actually now have Planet as part of our new 5-year business strategy as we're moving forwards, because we've really identified it as something that we really want to focus on, and also somewhere where we feel like we can make an impact, we can make a difference. So we've sort of built our strategy on how we're going to get there, but also not forgetting the other elements of sustainability that are really important to us, which are more around food in our supply chain and also people. So looking after not only our own people, but also the communities and our customers and all of those who are kind of affected by us existing as an organisation, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Great, yeah, and I think that's often one of the, I guess, the first sort of starting points is kind of assessing your environmental impact kind of as an organisation and kind of working through that sort of process, I guess, as well.
Exactly, and as I say, we've done a lot in the past, but it's kind of it got to that point where it was now like, okay, we really need to bring this together, and we need to understand a bit better actually where are we, and what is that kind of baseline, and where do we want to be, because until we understand that, we're never going to know how we're going to get to where we want to be. We need to know what that starting point is. So that's kind of some of the work that we were undertaking when we were developing our strategy, was all around gathering as much data as we possibly could, to make sure that we could get that lay of the land of, okay, this is where we are, and these are some of the improvements that we're going to need to make.
Definitely. Yeah, and I guess one of the key sort of processes that I guess has helped you, I guess, develop that initial outlook is the development of a carbon footprint. So essentially, for those on the call, a carbon footprinting sort of exercise is one of the ways you can measure your environmental impact as an organization. And so there are various kind of methodologies that organizations globally can follow when it comes to kind of measuring your environmental impact, measuring your carbon emissions of your organization as well. So Megan, I think it'd be great to understand the justification and sort of interest in developing that carbon footprint. So you mentioned it helps you kind of set that environmental baseline and kind of provides the kind of starting point for that as well. Are there any other sort of key elements that you thought was an interesting part of that footprinting process on that journey?
I think it's just the focusing in on the different elements. I mean, when you go to start doing the footprinting itself, the amount of different data sources that go into making up that footprint is huge, really, when you actually think about all of the different aspects that can make up that footprint. It's everything from energy used actually within our factories through to how we're getting stuff to the supermarket, what our customers are actually doing with that product once it's in their homes, how our employees are getting to work. Like, there's so much involved in it. And I just think that really helps you to start thinking, okay, even if it doesn't feel like it, even if it feels like there's this huge task in front of you, actually, when you break it down into each of these different pieces, there are some quick wins in there, and so there are some things that actually you have a lot of control over, and you can start to make changes straight away. Yes, there will be things that are much bigger and more difficult to tackle, but actually having that focus and just going through that initial process, if nothing else, of just trying to find all the data and gather it together, was super helpful for us, because it just really helped us, as I say, to kind of go, okay, well, here's a few areas that immediately we can see places that we can make changes to. And I think when I came into the role, having our carbon footprint just to me seemed like a no-brainer, really. As I say, it's one of those, a planet is one of the parts of our business strategy. It's now a big part of our sustainability strategy as well. And I don't think you can have ambitions around environment without knowing what your carbon footprint is. It's so important. And you know, at Higgidy, we recognise the climate emergency, and we recognise just how important it is that we need to be reducing our carbon emissions. So having our carbon footprint calculated, yeah, as I say, just seemed like something that, why wouldn't we do that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think certainly with a lot of, clients that we speak to at Aid Associates who are kind of just sort of starting out their journey, the key recommendation, as kind of a first port of call, is to actually start measuring and understanding where your emissions lie, and what kind of actions can be taken in order to reduce that. So yeah, that's great. That's kind of the starting point for Higgidy as well. So we do have some slides on the footprint of Higgidy itself. So we'll kind of go into those in a bit of detail in the next couple of questions. But Megan, in terms of that process of calculating a footprint, how was that as a process? Were there any sort of challenges, any sort of difficulties with collecting the data? I know there's quite a sort of data heavy exercise. So yeah, what were your kind of feedbacks and thoughts on that process?
I think as a process, overall, it was good. I think that I can't say that there wasn't challenges, mostly from a collecting of the data. I think for us, this is something quite new. We'd not done anything like this before. The data was there. It's just figuring out where it is within the organisation and actually pulling it out. We don't currently measure everything, but actually one of the great things about going through this process is it's actually been able to help us identify where those gaps exist in our data, and actually what we need to be measuring as well. So it's not just about what we already do measure and what that tells us, but actually how can we make this even better, and what other data, what alternative data could we start collecting so that in future years we're able to actually get an even more accurate footprint. But yeah, I would say in terms of challenges, it's just figuring out what data you have and pulling it all together. But the template that 8 Associates provided was really, really helpful because it's all broken down, so you can have it all in sort of each part written out so you can see which bits you're missing. And actually having those conversations that we had, Rob, about, okay, well, you don't have this data, but actually, have you got this? And we might be able to, you know, kind of use some of that at least in this initial stage and work on that later. So yeah, and I think now that we've gone through that process as well, it means that in future years, it will be a lot easier. People understand what we're asking for, and we've actually started logging it a bit better. And yeah, people kind of understand the urgency and the need for it. That really, really helps as well. I think the people who were most responsive to coming back with data were the ones who really understood this is really important because we want to calculate our carbon footprint.
Definitely, yeah. And I think that's also sort of a, I guess, a process that we've recognised sort of internally at 8 Associates as well. It is a process towards measuring your footprint. So when an organisation is looking to set that initial baseline, there are going to be challenges or there are going to be gaps to collecting that data. And so I guess, yeah, it's all about being transparent in any of the assumptions that have been used for that footprint calculation. And I guess sort of more importantly, building on those findings and kind of setting up ways and processes to slowly kind of improve that data collection process over time. So it is a process towards sort of getting the most sort of up to date and sort of complete footprint calculation and data set, but that does take time and will depend on, you know, internal organizational processes as well. Fantastic. So I think we can sort of get into some detail then about the actual footprint of Higgidy. So just to provide a bit of background in terms of the baseline year that was set for this calculation. So we followed sort of best practice guidelines when it comes to setting a baseline. So we work closely with yourself, Megan, and your team to kind of have that discussion around what is a sort of reliable and sort of, you know, feasible baseline to set. And so 2019 was identified as that year for a number of reasons, ranging from things like COVID, that sort of had an impact on, you know, global businesses as well. So I guess that also sort of made it a challenge from a data collection point of view, Megan, backdating and trying to collect data from, you know, almost 2 years ago as well. So that's another sort of consideration to be aware of when setting a baseline. So Megan, do you just want to give us an insight into, you know, what the footprint was across Higgidy? What are some of the key hotspots across the organisation as well?
Yeah. So yeah, through the footprint process, we discovered that 88% of our footprint is within our scope 3, so our indirect emissions. But being a manufacturing business, that wasn't an immediate surprise to us. But it is great to kind of have a better understanding of how that whole thing is made up. And within our scope 1, I think what was most interesting for me was the fact that the majority of that is refrigerant gases, which again shouldn't really be a surprise when you're a chill food manufacturer. Obviously, we use a lot of gases to keep chillers cold and fridges and freezers, and we've got lots of things trying to keep all of our foods at the right temperatures. But that one, I think that was a great example of one of these sort of quick wins, somewhere we have control over which refrigerant gases we use. That's one of the ones that we can immediately start to look at. But I was quite surprised that that was higher than gas usage, I must say, because obviously we use a lot of energy to power our site. So yeah, I think 88% being in the scope 3, as I say, isn't necessarily surprising, but it's certainly challenging because it will mean that a lot of that is kind of outside of our immediate control. So I think the makeup of our footprint kind of shows that we can do quite a lot, but actually it's going to potentially be a much longer term process because it's going to involve working with a lot of other people, working with our suppliers to actually start to shift that. So yeah, this is just one 1 year. So hopefully once we start to get a few more years of footprinting, we can start to kind of see those trends and see whether that remains as well. As Rob said, it'll be interesting to see how COVID years have whether they've been affected and changed. Obviously, there was lots of changes within the business at that point. So yeah, that's sort of how our footprint's made up at the moment.
Yeah, and I think that's some really interesting results. I think with refrigerant gas specifically, it won't be that you're using kind of more volume than the natural gas, for example, but the global warming potential and the associated emission factor that kind of sits behind that is just much higher. So as you mentioned, Megan, you know, there are alternative refrigerant gases that are available. So I think that's been an interesting sort of take home from the results as well. I'm interested now to kind of, I guess, go into detail of Scope 1 specifically. So how have you kind of used these results, I guess, internally across the organization to, I guess, yeah, to kind of encourage action, and how have you used the analysis to kind of, yeah, kind of adapt to those results?
So we got our carbon footprint calculated at the same time in which we were writing our sustainability strategy, which was really helpful because obviously we got these results in. So the way that we worked with you guys was to get our scope 1 and 2 back first, so that we at least had that, and then we were working on the scope 3 separately. So we actually knew our scope 1 and 2 results quite early on, and it just meant that we were just able to feed into strategies and work streams that are happening. We're actually going through a period of expansion at the moment at Higgidy, and so looking at where refrigerant gases are, where we're using electric, where we're using gas, bringing in new equipment and things like that. It just really helped to kind of bolster my conversations that I was having, I suppose, and saying, you know, when this new equipment comes in, it needs to be much more energy efficient. That will help us reduce our carbon footprint, and here's the evidence of that. So yeah, and I think when we're looking at scope 3, that's when it really came into the strategy stuff. As I say, that's the much more complex part of it, and actually scope 1 and 2 is where we're having those conversations already, and they're kind of part of the everyday, whereas the scope 3 is the part that we're looking much deeper into, and actually having to have much more thoughtful conversations around that in terms of how we're actually gonna make change here, because it is that much more complex process, as I say.
Yeah, and I think scope 3 is the challenge for all organizations, I think. So actually it was interesting to see the results of this footprint, for example, because typically, depending on obviously different sectors, there's variations, but for a typical organization, we would expect scope 3 to make up around 80 to 90%. So obviously the kind of the low-hanging fruits, the quick wins, normally are associated with your scope 1 and 2 emissions. But of course, where the challenges come into play, and unfortunately the largest source of emissions for a lot of companies is scope 3. And scope 3 is kind of I guess a diverse range of emission sources that can be included in that actual calculation. So here we've just got a breakdown of Higgidy scope 3 emissions, again for the same 2019 baseline. So we can see, you know, there's a real sort of spread of emission sources that have initially been included. But what we can also see is there are some real hotspots across the organisation as well. And that's usually the case for a lot of organisations. And typically, a lot of scope 3 will be associated with emissions from purchased goods and services. And what that calculation does is essentially try and capture kind of all of the emissions associated with procuring a product or service into your business, you know, as part of your business model as well. So I think it's useful to spend a bit of time on these purchased goods and services. So of course, Higgidy being a food manufacturer, the emissions associated with this category are all to do with the ingredients that the organisation procures in during a typical reporting year. So one of the things we're able to do, and I must say this was as a result of the really sort of complete and in-depth data sets that we were able to obtain from Higgidy, we were able to actually break down those emissions per food group, which you can see on the slide there. So Megan, I guess in terms of emissions from these ingredients and working with suppliers, what's the kind of the next steps for Higgidy in terms of engaging with selected suppliers and trying to kind of act on these emissions as well?
So as you say, ingredients has come out as being such an important part of our footprint. So it's really been something that we've been focused on in our strategy. And so we will be implementing a green procurement programme that's sort of already underway. And as part of that, it's essentially a bit of investigation work in the beginning, just to kind of gather some data from all of our suppliers, just to find out what it is that they're already doing. And also then looking at actually taking our top 10 and working with them to see how we can make improvements. So that's kind of one side of what we're doing, just looking at our existing supply chain and how we can make that better. We also we're a veggie-led brand. We're not completely veggie vegan, but we are very much veggie led. And we've also set ourselves a target to make sure that 75% of our range remains veggie vegan. We do use meat, but it's in small proportions. But as you can see from our breakdown of emissions, meat is the second biggest in terms of our emissions, in terms of ingredients. So it's also therefore looking at where we're getting those sources of meat from, who we're working with. We already work with some really good suppliers, but it's just kind of leveraging those partnerships. And as part of our green procurement process, just kind of we'll be looking at making sure that we've got a bit of I don't want to call it a code of practice, but that sort of thing, where our suppliers know exactly what we're expecting from them, that we do expect them to be coming up with ways to reduce their own footprint, which will obviously have a knock-on effect and reduce ours. And it also is just looking at, as I say, where we're getting things from. Can we get things more local? We already have a huge majority of our suppliers are already within the UK or much closer to us down in the southeast. There's only a handful that aren't. So we're already doing pretty well in that journey, but it's whether we can go any further with that as well. So all of these things have been included in our new sustainability strategy under our food pillar. So as I say, that's we're starting that now based on this data, and once we've got the next couple of years of footprinting data as well, that will only help us even further to kind of really drill down. I think when you think about supply chain, obviously for us it's massive, and if we try and tackle the entire thing, I think we'll just be overwhelming ourselves, and that's why we're really trying to just kind of focus on that top 10 to begin with, and we will expand out, and we're coming up with a plan as to what that's going to look like over the next 5, 10, 15 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think supply chain emissions are going to be one of the most difficult categories to kind of get down and decarbonize. And with a lot of the clients that we're speaking with across 8 associates, across multiple industries, it has to be said, there's all been sort of, I guess, holistic calls for more kind of supply chain, industrial kind of group-led initiatives to reduce those emissions. And we're seeing a lot of examples of exactly that, Megan. For example, green procurement policies, where a certain supplier or supplier base will kind of have to either kind of initially report on what their emissions are as an organization, or in some cases as well, actually will have to meet certain kind of emissions thresholds for individual products in order to keep working with that supplier and that organization, essentially. So yeah, there's a number of, I guess, different and interesting ways that that's being sort of worked on across the industry in terms of trying to reduce emissions from suppliers and supply chain as well. So I think it's going to be an interesting space to kind of work and see what kind of happens out of that as well. So just kind of briefly jumping back to, I guess, your overall Scope 3 footprint, Megan, are there any other sort of hotspots that stand out to you in terms of that needs to be focused on initially for Higgidy, and what other things are kind of I guess a main focus for the organisation as it looks to reduce that overall footprint?
So in terms of our main focuses, I think essentially in the very beginning it's anything that we have immediate control over, other things where we're looking to start. Things like transport and distribution, we have some control, so we're starting to look into some of that. But there's also some areas which you helped us to identify that I think are those ones where we have control, but it's also about how much of an impact is that going to have. And so things like employee commuting, although it's a much smaller impact, actually that's something that we can really engage with our people on, and we can start to look at that quite quickly. In the same way that I mentioned refrigerant gases on scope 1, it's something that we feel like we can make a pretty quick change on. Energy related activity as well, although obviously we can't immediately reduce how much energy we're using. It's something that we have control over and we are able to make changes to. We can switch to green tariffs, and we can make sure that, as I say, all the equipment that we're buying is much more energy efficient. And waste is something that we're really, really focused on as well. As I say, again, even though when you look at it on a scale here, it's quite low down the list, actually, in terms of what we have control over. We have a lot more control over that than we do over a lot of the other things, and it obviously has other environmental impacts as well, not just carbon related. So that's sort of another reason that we've chosen to focus on waste, is thinking about the slightly bigger picture around our whole sustainability journey. So we are working on waste strategies at the moment as well, particularly around food waste, which obviously have carbon associated with that as well. So brilliant. I don't know if you want to bring up the graph, Rob, that you created for us, because that was really helpful.
Yeah, sure. I was just going to say, like, in terms of kind of the process, so in the journey, if we go back to that, kind of take a step back, so we've now got to the point where Higgidy as an organization kind of understand where those emissions hotspots are, what their sort of baseline footprint is. And I guess the next step in the process, and this is something that 8 Associates supported with kind of throughout that process, was to really identify what actions can be developed into kind of short and longer term timeframes. So it's just an example of sort of a process diagram, if you like, of kind of the immediate actions and areas of focus for the organisation. So Megan, as you mentioned, the initial focus was around all of those emission sources that Higgidy either has direct control over or sort of partial control as well. So I think this is a good diagram to sort of I guess map out where your emissions are in terms of kind of obviously total emissions by tons of carbon, but also it's really important to actually consider what the influence of your organisation is on these emissions. And that's very sort of that's fair enough. You've got to map out what you can actually do and what can be focused on sort of further down the line as well. So I think that's quite a good diagram to kind of visualize that. So in terms of, I guess, steps beyond this point, so we've got to the point where, as I said, we've understood our emissions. We kind of know what sort of actions we'd like to take to actually reduce those emissions. But if we take it kind of a step further, Megan, what other kind of insights have you taken from this kind of footprinting exercise? And I think specifically around sort of target setting, and how have you used the results of this process to actually shape what sort of targets Higgidy would like to work towards as well?
Yeah, so as I say, footprinting was a really key part of developing our strategy, and it was something that we were doing alongside our strategy development. And obviously having targets is a really key part of our strategy. And so once we'd kind of established what our footprint looked like, we were really keen to make sure that we got some targets and we got them implemented pretty quickly. So we have committed to being net zero by 2040, but we didn't just want to have a net zero target that feels quite far. It's not that far away, but it feels quite far away. So we wanted to make sure that we also had some interim targets in there as well. So we've also looked at scope 1 and 2 and scope 3 separately, and based on sort of the SBTi guidelines, have set a target of a 4.2% reduction year on year by 2030 for scope 1 and 2, and then for scope 3 by 2.5% the same time frame. So now having those targets, now that we're writing separate strategies for a carbon strategy, for example, that's really helping us with those pathways to think, those are quite big. 4% is quite a lot. So it's sort of helping us to focus on how we actually going to get there now, and that's kind of the next stage, I suppose, of our journey that we're now embarking on, is actually taking the results that we've got from our footprint, the target of where we want to be, and now it's mapping out exactly how we're going to get there. And we're using things like the things noticed here as a starting point, just to really help us identify those focus areas. And as I say, once we've got more years of footprinting under our belt as well, that will only make that process better.
Sure. Yeah, and I think this is a really kind of interesting point in the consultancy journey that the associates take clients through. And when we get to this point, it's always good to obviously consider the results of the footprint, and actually try and map out what can be done over time. So what we'll typically do at associates with sort of Higgidy and many other clients is actually map out your emissions over time. And we sort of call that pathways analysis. So we can actually kind of project out, take into consideration the findings from various site visits across the states as well. And that sort of process of mapping out your emissions over time, having a kind of the line in the sand, whether that be 2040, 2050, can actually help inform that target setting process. And that is an exercise that we did go through with yourself, Megan, was that sort of pathways analysis. And hopefully that was able to provide you with that initial outlook on, okay, what can our emissions, what will they look like sort of over time as well?
And I think for us as well, it was making sure that we wanted to be ambitious. We didn't want to kind of look at our footprint and go, oh, well, we can easily get to that, so we'll say that that's what our reduction is. Actually, we wanted to be ambitious, but we also wanted to be realistic. We didn't want to set some really outrageous target that we were never going to meet, because you've got to keep people motivated. You've got to feel like you're definitely going to get there, and to be honest, if we get there earlier than that, then that's amazing, and that will always be the goal. But having that pathway to know it is realistic, you can get there, and being able to see it on a graph makes it less daunting, I suppose, as well. That there are things that we can do, and it is feasible for us to get there. We've just got to start implementing things.
Definitely, yeah, that's really interesting. And in terms of, I guess, tracking progress towards that net zero sort of target, Megan, how does you and your team intend to kind of track that sort of progress towards meeting that over time as well?
So for the first time ever this year, we released an impact report. So that will be where we're going to be publishing these results. So that's going to come out annually in sort of May, June time, and we'll have our carbon footprinting results and all of our other sustainability results in that as well. But obviously annually is not that often. So within the business, it's now one of our kind of business, our leadership team's KPIs. We have them quarterly, make sure that they understand what's going on. So we report internally very regularly. And I think that's really important because it kind of keeps everybody on track in terms of how we're doing. Because obviously carbon footprinting, and it affects every single person within the business, really. Every single person within the business has a role to play, directly or indirectly, in one of the different strategies or work streams that we're working on to reduce our footprint. So just keeping people informed and updated with our progress is super, super important. So we'll be having our 2020 and 2021 footprint calculated at the end of this year, so that we can release that in our next impact report next year. And then moving forwards, obviously we'll have an annual footprint, which will be reported annually in that report as well.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, is to once you've actually set that formal target, is to map out what that process looks like towards actually measuring your performance against that, and sort of whether it's creating sort of annual KPIs or targets on that trajectory. That's often a good way of doing it as well. In terms of the kind of internal process, Megan, that you went through towards setting that target, what was that process like? Were there any sort of stakeholders or sort of teams that you involved in making that sort of formal declaration to net zero? And what was that process like for you?
So we obviously involved our leadership team. So it started with a conversation myself and you, Rob, and a few of the team, just to work out what was the best target for us to have. And we talked about net zero, carbon neutral, all these other various different terms that are out there, and really decided that for us, net zero was the one that felt most authentic. And once we'd kind of come up with that and looked at the pathway of how we were going to get there, it was then down to me essentially to have a conversation with our leadership team and to explain that to them. And they were all on board. As I say, we looked at science-based targets, so it all had a lot of thought around it. And so yeah, once they understood that that's how we got there based on data. I think that's the super important thing. As I say, we didn't just pluck something from the air. It was a very well thought out target.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's the best way of doing it, is to involve kind of all relevant stakeholders, all relevant teams. So I think a crucial aspect of any organisation that's looking to set any form of target, it's got to be embedded across the whole organisation, and all various teams have got to be on board with that and kind of working towards that common goal. But of course, it's also got to fit in with the wider strategic aims and objectives of the organisation as well. So any sort of process that kind of marries those up in a similar vein is a really good sort of way of doing it as well. So again, sort of taking a step out, we've now had that sort of target set and formally kind of set at the organizational level. So I guess the final piece of the puzzle is actually then verifying the calculation and footprint results that have been developed. So this is something and a process that is a process at 8 Associates. So we have our own verification partner called Natural Carbon Solutions. And what they do is provide that third-party assurance that all of the footprint calculations, all of the assessment methodologies that we as 8 Associates, as the consultancy, have provided Higgidy are robust, and that they align with industry-leading standards from both the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and ISO 14064 as well. So at the end of that process, in terms of kind of an output of that verification exercise, is the issuance of what you can see on the slide there, which is a carbon measured label, which we have issued to Higgidy. And this screenshot is actually from the impact report, which we'll go into a bit more detail on in the next slide. But I guess, Megan, just interested to kind of hear your thoughts and I guess feedback on the label itself and how this is going to be used kind of internally across Higgidy, and the value of using this label as well.
Yeah, so I think when we looked for a carbon footprinting partner, verification was actually one of the top things on my list in terms of something that I wanted to make sure was done. I think for us, it shows we've done it properly, basically, that it's legitimate, but it also just helps to give us credibility. The fact that we've kind of had this externally verified, we've followed all the, as exactly as you say, all the correct sort of procedures and things. So we are using this label within our report so that we can quickly and easily show that to people that this has been verified. And then moving forwards, we'd love to move to the other labeling that exists. I think the next one is carbon reduced, which obviously would be brilliant, and we can kind of set that as a bit of a goal for us as well, that we want to move from carbon measured to carbon reduced. We'd like to have 2 labels on there in the next report.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think it's a verification journey as well that we take clients on at 8 Associates as well. So yeah, the next kind of label after this is carbon reduced, which requires evidence that an organisation has actually reduced their emissions from their initial baseline. And then there are various other sort of labels and phases that we can issue to clients as well. And there's a carbon neutral label, a net zero carbon committed label, which recognises a net zero target alongside other requirements, and also a net zero carbon label as well. So there's kind of a range of labels that can be used and can be issued as part of the Natural Carbon Solutions verification process as well. Great. So I think we've briefly touched on the impact report kind of itself, but I think communication is a really key thing to I guess just wrap up this initial discussion on specifically. So as we've gone through that process, we've got a formal target, we've kind of verified that footprint and assessment. The next kind of key thing is to then communicate the results of that footprint, which is exactly what Higgidy have been able to do kind of in their impact report. So there's a few kind of just outputs from that impact report itself. But Megan, could you just give us an insight into, I guess, the justification and kind of background into developing an impact report and kind of the plans for developing that report over time with updated sort of footprints and those sorts of things as well?
Yeah, so as part of building our strategy and as part of being a B Corp, it really felt like transparency and sharing what we're up to is so important. So we actually used our impact report also as an opportunity to launch what our new strategy would be. And it was for that reason, but also because it gave us a structure actually to report on. So in the future years, we'll be reporting on our performance based on what our strategy is. So our strategy, as I mentioned, is called Our Recipe for Responsible Business, and we focus on 3 specific areas that are important to us. So planet is a really obvious one, and then we've split that down into sort of some smaller little sections within that. So within planet, we've got our carbon reduction journey, taking action on food waste and improving our packaging's life cycle. Within people, it's all about diversity and inclusion and making sure that we're creating a diverse and inclusive workplace, and also giving back to our local communities. So that's a lot about what we're doing with charity partners. And a lot of this all feeds into each other. So one of our main charity partners is Fair Share. They help us a lot with food waste. So it's all kind of interlinked amongst these 3 ingredients, we like to call them. And then in food, we're looking at sourcing with care. So where we're getting ingredients from, using high quality ingredients and baking veggie-led food, as I already mentioned. So we're really excited to have a strategy. Because I think it just, as I say, it really helps people to focus. I think it's such an enormous topic that we could have, these boxes could just be a list of 10 various different things, but we've really tried to hone in on those things that have felt really important to us. And yeah, moving forwards, our impact report will look at each of these sections, and each of the sections within the report we've written a to-do list. So each year we can literally go through and tick off or say, yeah, we're halfway through to that, or this bit still needs a little bit of work and this is what we're going to do to get there. And obviously each year we'll be putting our carbon footprint in there as well, and being able to measure year on year how we're looking, whether we still think we're on target. If we're not, what are we going to do to change that? So I think having that impact report will really challenge us to make sure that we are staying on track and we are looking at our reports, because essentially it's going to go out there, it's external, it's on our website. We're all about being transparent and letting people know what we're up to. So
definitely, yeah, I think that's great. And certainly when I was sort of scrolling through the impact report, it was fantastic to see that, the clarity on the process that you as an organization had been on to, initially understanding your footprint, and then what that actually means for you as an organization in terms of kind of target setting, and what are the next steps in terms of tracking that progress. So yeah, that was really great to see, and I think that shines through in the actual report itself. Great. So I guess just finally, Megan, for the audience and attendees today, are there any final insights that you'd like to share in terms of, any advice for beginning this sort of process? I know at times it can be seen to be quite a daunting process, is sort of measuring your emissions and thinking about where do I start. So are there any sort of final insights and lessons learned from the process that you'd like to share today?
I suppose finding this is going to sound like a sales pitch and it entirely isn't. Finding the right consultant has been really helpful. I certainly wouldn't have been able to calculate a carbon footprint on my own. It's very, very complex. So finding the right expertise who are going to help you to do that is super, super important. But I guess I would say don't think that you're too small, or you don't have enough data, or you don't have enough information already. You've got to start somewhere. And actually, you've probably got more data than you think you do. To be able to come up with something would probably be one of the biggest take homes that I would say that I had. I think at Higgidy we were quite lucky that we did already have quite a lot written down. But I think going through that process is part of how you're going to get better, and you identifying the gaps in that data and actually where you can improve that data, and just having that baseline is really then going to help you to know where you need to move to. So I would just say don't be daunted by the idea that this is a huge undertaking, and it's loads and loads of work, because actually a lot of the work is in the initial setup and just figuring out where you're getting that data from, and then moving forwards it's actually helping you to narrow your focus, and find what those targets are going to be.
Sure, great. Yeah, that's good to hear, and I think that's going to be really useful for the attendees that have joined this afternoon. So that sort of brings me to the QA session. So we've got roughly sort of 5-10 minutes to answer, open up the floor and ask any questions that may have. So if you do have a question, please just feel free to put it in the Teams chat, the conversation for today's webinar. And we'll try our best to answer any questions that do come through in the time that we have remaining today. So are there any initial questions? Yeah, I think there's a few coming through. Great, so we've got a question in the chat there. So Megan, I think this is probably one for you. How have you gone about engaging all of your staff across the organisation, and not just sort of senior leadership teams and those sorts of teams as well?
So I guess for us it's challenging engaging the teams, because we have teams who work within the office, who work with me, who are kind of more directly involved in the different bits that we're doing. But we also have about 350 people who all work within our production areas, who are very, very busy, busy getting product out the door. So actually it's engaging those people that is the most challenging bit, and that's kind of the journey that we're on at the moment. We use a lot of different internal communications channels, as I'm sure are pretty regular amongst most organisations, making sure that our shift managers are aware of things that we're up to, so that they can pass that information on. Within the office, we've started setting up sort of working groups for some of these different strategies, and that's really helpful, actually giving ownership to other people that aren't just the sustainability manager for a lot of these different topics. And something that we'll be looking to introduce coming up, actually, is because this is actually all very new to us. We've only just started releasing this strategy within the past couple of months, so this is all sort of planned activity. So I can't give you any feedback in terms of how well these sorts of things are going just yet. But we are looking at doing things like listen lunches and listen and learns, and just asking people, kind of presenting them with the challenge and saying, what do you think? This is the scale of what we need to do. Have you got any ideas? And I think actually having those two-way conversations is the most important part. We're very good at that at Higgidy, to be fair, in terms of people feel quite open to make suggestions. We have suggestion boxes and various different things. But I think it's just trying to explain what we're up to, but in little bite-sized portions, I think is the best way to engage people who perhaps don't have all the time to sit and listen to us talk about an entire strategy. But the people sort of management level and above have all got a copy of the report. They're all very well versed with it. So it kind of depends on who we're engaging as to how much information we're sharing. I'm also creating a handbook, which is a much more staff focused version, which basically says, okay, this is our strategy and all of that stuff, but actually what does that mean to you as a Higgidy employee? What actually can you do every day at work that are little things that actually will make a big difference? So it's just kind of breaking it down and making it a bit more relatable to everyday roles.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's exactly it. I think, Megan, in terms of, as I said, it's important to engage all staff members and all teams in the process, because at the end of the day, they're going to be the ones that are actually working towards that for the organisation. So that, I think that's a really important point. We've had a follow-up question, which I guess sort of piggybacks off what we just discussed there, Megan, is, do you think the person who drives this needs to do it as a dedicated role, or do you think it could be achieved as part of another daily role, and sort of questions around, I guess, the workload that's gone into this process from your side as well.
Yeah, I don't think you necessarily need to be a sustainability manager or an environment manager to do the carbon footprinting process. A lot of the role is actually just coordinating, gathering all that data together. So actually very little of the data came from my own sources. A lot of it came from procurement or sort of our facilities teams, our warehousing teams. So my job really was just to be the middle person and say, can I please have this data from you? Can I please have this data from you? So you definitely don't need to be a sustainability manager or an environment manager. I think you need to have the time to dedicate to it. And it was probably a 3 or 4 month process all in all. But it would be every other week checking in with Rob to see where we're at, and a few hours probably of data collection, if I counted it all together up front. So it needs dedication, but it's not a huge undertaking, I would say, and it could definitely be part of somebody else's role.
Great, thank you, Megan. There's also a question in the chat around sort of hotspots and how, I guess, the emissions hotspots outside of Higgidy's direct control are actually managed and how we account for those in an actual footprint. So I think that's one that I can take. So yeah, I think we've discussed kind of the complexities and difficulties of trying to capture emissions from Scope 3 sources. So when it comes to, yeah, I guess measuring those emissions, it's really, I guess, one of the first steps is taking that step back and having that initial discussion on what data sets are available, and being happy with any data sets that are used for that calculation. And then actually after that is being transparent on any of the assumptions that have been used for that calculation, and actually coming up with a plan, a strategy to improve the quality of that data over time. And in terms of action, yeah, again, those hotspots that are outside of the control of, for example, Higgidy, are more difficult to decarbonize. And certainly, we're still seeing industry-led initiatives still evolving at this stage. And I think there's a kind of a cross-sectoral recognition that, Scope 3 is one of the more harder areas to decarbonize. And so very much, I think, it'll be a process and a strategy towards measuring, continually measuring, and ultimately reducing those emissions as well. Fantastic. Well, I think we'll leave the questions there. We've got just 5 minutes to go. Don't want to keep you any longer. So really, yeah, that's kind of the end of today's webinar. So hopefully what we've aimed to do is sort of take you through that sustainability journey that we have taken Higgidy through. So a copy of the slides and the recording will be sent through after today's session. But yeah, really just finally to say a big thank you to you, Megan, for joining this webinar today. I think it's been a really interesting discussion. And thank you to all of the attendees who've joined us this afternoon. And yeah, have a great rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Rob.